Amen. Well, good morning, everybody. Our mic seems to have given out for just a few minutes ago, so we're making adjustments. That way, if you're watching on Facebook, you should be able to hear us today. And if you're here in person, we're going to find out how loud I can really be. You're going to realize that I never actually need the mic, but it just is fun to have a mic. Right? It makes it a lot easier sometimes, but we're going to be all right this morning. We are going to be good, and it's going to be an absolutely incredible time. I am so excited. We shared a few weeks ago as we were getting ready to start this series that I just firmly believe that this is a series that can absolutely change lives and can change how we experience everything about our walk with God. And so this is going to be a great time as we head into week 2. If you're taking notes today we're going to be talking about available in difficulty. Right? The Bible is full of stories about one kind of people. And that one kind has nothing to do with race. That one kind has nothing to do with gender. And that one kind has nothing to do with age. The Bible is full of stories of one kind of people. Of people who made themselves available to God. But I love as we read through the Bible, what we actually begin to see and understand is that what the Bible tells us and what happens in the world tie together. The Bible's history and world's history tie together. And sometimes the world will try to tell us something over here, but really the Bible is giving us even more insight into what was happening than what the world understands. One of the things that the Bible tells us about is the Babylonian Empire. Right? When we go to school, we begin to study and learn, and they teach us about one of the greatest empires in the history of the world. And the Babylonian Empire began to reign around the world in that time. And what they would do is the Babylonian Empire, as they were making their way across and they would conquer a country, they would conquer a country over here. And then what they began to do is they began to make the people to be like they were. And so one of the countries that this happened to was Israel. The Babylonian Empire comes along and they conquer the nation of Israel. We know this as God's judgment on Israel because Israel had walked away from God. And God told Israel, if you do not turn from your wicked ways, this is what's coming. Prophets began to prophesy, and we read through Isaiah and we read through Jeremiah, who begins to prophesy and say it's going to be 70 years that you're here. And we begin to read about the Babylonian Empire. And at some point, the Babylonian Empire, they took some of the Jews and they brought them to another place to begin to live so that they couldn't be around their own culture, their own people, their own beliefs, because they were going to train them to become Babylonian. You see this in the book of Daniel, where they begin to take Daniel and they begin to give him another name. And you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whose names have been changed because they're now in Babylon. And so Babylon has conquered Israel, they've taken it, and then eventually what happens is Babylon gets conquered as well. And we see the rise of the Persian Empire. One of the capitals of the Persian Empire was a city named Susa. And it's in Susa that we find a Jew named Mordecai and his cousin Esther, who are there because generations before, when Babylon had conquered Israel, Mordecai and Esther's family had been taken and planted in the city. But we see that even in the midst of turmoil, even in the midst of judgment for Israel, even in the midst of things going crazy and not how we would expect, that God never abandons his people, but that he still chooses to work through those who are available. And so we find Mordecai and we find Esther, and our story starts when the new Persian king Xerxes begins his search for a new queen. Esther chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Now there was in the citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and trusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. War, exiles, and a harem. This is where we would expect some crazy story from the world to begin. This is not what we would expect to be the opening scene of a Bible story where God is getting ready to save the Jewish people from genocide. And yet this is where God begins his story. See, God, he doesn't always work in a way that we think he should. And he doesn't always work in the way that we think makes sense. But God is always working. Even in the times we don't understand, even in the times when everything looks like it's out of control, even in the times when nothing is in our mind as it should be, God is still working. See, we're introduced to Esther here. Esther was an orphan. Her father and her mother had both died. She had a cousin named Mordecai who adopted her and raised her as his own. Esther is in exile, living in a land that's not her own. She's forced to become like a people who are not her own. Even in her name, right? Her name, she's revealed to us as Esther, but it says that her name was Hadassah, right? And so again, her name has been changed. And all of a sudden we have this Jewish girl living in exile, away from everything, who's an orphan, who's taken by a Persian king to be a part of his harem. See, Esther, man, if you looked at her story, if you looked at her life, if you looked at everything that was against her, you would see a mess. But it's in the middle of mess that sometimes God creates his best masterpiece. Sometimes we look at people in the world, and we look around us and we see people and we say, well, look at their family. Look at their history. Look at what they've done. Look at what they struggle with. Look at this and look at that. And we think that because of everything we see to identify them, that they're not the ones that God can use. But God doesn't look for that. God looks for one thing when he's looking for people to use. He looks for somebody who will be available. And God looked into this mess of a life and he found this girl named Esther. And Esther was the one that God was choosing to use. The question would become, would Esther be available? See, Esther was taken without choice to be a part of the king's harem. And what that meant was that she was going to become a part of the king's harem, right? In other parts of the Bible, we read about kings with concubines. That's where Esther was headed. She was taken without choice to be a part of a harem where the king was searching for a queen, and he was bringing all of these, right? It says right there in what we read, it says, many girls were taken to the citadel in Susa. They began to go through training. They were taken from their family, and for a year, they were put into a house together, and they went through different kinds of treatments and beauty treatments to made to look a certain way. And then, one at a time, they'd be called to the king for him to sleep with. And after the king was able to sleep with them, he would send them to a house where they would live the rest of their life. Maybe, if the king was happy with them, he would call them back, and they could sleep with them again. If not, they would live the rest of their life in this house. And that's where Esther was more than likely heading. The king called many women. He was going to choose one to be the new king, the new queen. But for the rest of the women, they were going to be a part of the harem. They could never again have their own life. They could never have their own family. Everything was being taken from them. And this is where Esther found herself in this time in history. One of the most difficult questions to ask is, we're honest. Because we look at that situation and say, how could God allow something like that? And one of the questions that sometimes we get as believers and as Christians is, if God is real, why is there so much evil in the world? And the reality is, when God created everything, He created, and the Bible says He's created it, and it was good. But for something to be good, and for us to have the ability to enjoy the fact that it's good, we had to have the ability to choose. And so God created the first humans, Adam and Eve, and he set them in a place that was perfect and good, and everything was great, but they had the choice. And they ate from a tree that we call the knowledge of good and evil. See, and it was through that moment that evil entered into the world, and we see it even in the earth today. Earthquakes and famines and droughts and storms. They weren't a part of the original creation. They are a part of the evil that has taken place in the world. But not only did it plant itself into the world, but it placed itself into the human heart. And so we see evil actions taking place. And it's not that God is withdrawn. It's not that God doesn't care. It's that this world has been doomed. And the only way for destruction, or the only way for all of this to be fixed, is for God to destroy it all. But in reality, it is grace that allows things to go on. Because while destruction makes sense, and destruction would get rid of all of the evil, you and I within our hearts on our own are evil. And so God withholds judgment to extend grace and love in this time, that the world and that the people, you and I, would not be destroyed with the world. He withholds the correction, which means that the evil has to be allowed to continue, because he can't get rid of that without destroying all evil, including the evil in the hearts of people. And the only way to get rid of that is through Jesus Christ. Right? We sang that song this morning, glory to his name, glory to his name. There to my heart was the blood applied. See, it's the very blood of Jesus that pays that price, that washes the evil from you and I. And it's not that we become perfect, but it's that when God looks at us, he sees what Jesus did, because Jesus lived a perfect life. And so we walk in our new relationship with Jesus, and God is expecting you and I to be the life and the goodness and the light and the love in a world full of evil. That way that light can shine in darkness. See, darkness doesn't really exist. Darkness is what we use to describe the absence of light. And when you and I aren't doing what we need to be, when you and I aren't the light that God calls us to be, then people are going to see the darkness so much more. Because darkness is prevalent in this world, but God is calling you and I to be available to be a light in dark times. And Esther found herself in a position that was beyond her control, that she never would have chose, that she never would have volunteered and said, pick me. I want to be here. I want to give up my life. I want to give up everything. She found herself in a position that was beyond her control. Maybe you've been there. Things happen in life that are beyond your control. We have questions. We have doubts. We don't have the answers we want, but we have a choice. In those dark times, in those hard times, when everything is difficult, when everything seems impossible, will we be available? Will we choose to say, God, in this moment, when I don't understand, I'm still going to trust you. God, in this moment, when I don't understand everything that's happening, I'm still going to trust that you are good and that you are going to work through this situation. See, Esther's situation, if we're honest and we look at it, was a nightmare. It was a place that none of us would ever want to imagine ourselves. But as we read through the book of Esther, we find out that things were about to get a lot worse. See, we met Esther's cousin Mordecai, and as Esther is chosen, on one side, things look great because Esther is chosen to be the queen. Of all the women that were called, the many women that were brought to Susa, Esther alone, it says, pleased the king, and she was made the new queen. But on the other side of this, we have this evil advisor who was raised above all the other nobles at that time. His name was Haman. And Haman was very full of himself, and Haman, because of his new position, every day when he would walk into the citadel, every day he would walk into the king's palace, the others there would begin to bow to Haman. But for the Jews, they bowed to nobody except for God. And so all these other people, Haman would walk in and they begin to bow before Haman, and then Haman would get right before he's about to enter. And there's Mordecai. And he wasn't being disrespectful. And he wasn't yelling anything out at Haman. But Mordecai didn't bow. And Haman, he didn't like that. So Haman every day after day, he walks in, people are bowing, and they're bowing, and there's Mordecai. And Haman's like, why is this guy not bowing? And he gets so angry that he eventually comes with a plan. He says, you know what? I'm going to get revenge on this man. And not only am I going to get revenge on this man, but I know this man's a Jew. And so I'm going to get revenge on all of the Jews. And so he creates this plan, and he goes to the king, and he creates these lies in the story and begins to tell the king about the Jewish people. And he says, King, I think it would be in your best interest to get rid of this people. And the king said, all right, let's do it. And so the king signed a document decreeing that at the end of that year, there would be a day where all the people were to kill the Jews in that area. All of this was happening while neither the king nor Haman knew that Esther was a Jew. And all of a sudden the word begins to spread, and all of a sudden the Jews begin to see this proclamation all across the Persian Empire, and they're filled with despair. There's nothing they can do. The king has signed this decree, meaning that it will now be legal on that day, and that their destruction is coming. Mordecai breaks down, and they're there in this period of mourning, and they're beginning to just pray and seek after God, and they're not sure what's going on. But they know they find themselves in a moment of despair. So Mordecai sends this message to Esther. He begins to talk to Esther and say, Esther, who knows? He says, this may be the very reason that God put you there. This morning, somebody was telling me of a story where because one bad thing happened, they found out some other information that they would not have, where God is intervening in a situation right now that they wouldn't have been aware of if something hadn't happened first. See, sometimes that happens in life where God is moving well ahead of what we think, and God is putting pieces into position and things into position. And Mordecai tells Esther, he says, Esther, I don't know. He says, I don't have proof. He says, but what if this is the very reason you were made queen, that God could prepare for this moment right now, that you could intervene for the destruction of the Jews? Look at the position that you're in. What position are you in life? Maybe you find yourself in a place and you're questioning, God, why am I here? God, why would you allow this to happen? Not knowing that God is allowing you to be there because He has a plan and a purpose for you if you will choose to be available. See, Mordecai begins to call out to Esther, and he says, this is your responsibility. You need to do something. But Esther doesn't know what to do. She's talking to Mordecai through letters. She's having this correspondence. They're not talking face to face because Mordecai, he was in burlap. He wasn't allowed to come in because he was mourning. And so she couldn't go out and talk to him. And so they're going back and forth with each other. And she says, but Mordecai, the law says that anybody who goes before the king who's not summoned will be put to death. Unless the king sees you and extends his scepter. The law of the land says anybody who comes before the king without being summoned is to be killed right then and there. And she says, Mordecai, I may be the queen, but it's been 30 days since the king summoned me to be with him. What am I supposed to do? There's nothing I can do. I can't go before him. And sometimes we need to just take a step back because what we think we can and can't do, we don't realize. But we've just been so trained to believe something. And God's saying, if you'll just take a step back, you'll see that maybe you can actually do that very thing that you think you're not allowed to do. And so Esther begins to tell Mordecai, I've not been called to him for even a month. And she wasn't making the excuse, because Esther 4, verse 16, she's willing to die for her people. She says, I just don't even know what to do. Where do I begin in a situation like this? Where do I even begin to serve and do what God needs done? But Mordecai's words remind her, he says, not knowing how to do something, not knowing how something's going to play out, not having the answer to everything in life, he says that is not an excuse to sit back and to wait. He says you've got to take that step to be available for something to begin to happen. Right? The Bible so often talks about faith. Well, availability works in the exact same way. Being available, we can't be available and stay remaining in our seat. Peter couldn't remain in the boat and walk on water at the same time. He had to take that step. And that's what availability is for you and I. That when we make ourselves available, it means that we're taking a step of faith, saying, God, I'm yours. And we step out. And Mordecai was telling Esther, you may not have the answers, but if you're willing, then you've got to be ready to take that step. Esther chapter 4, verses 12 through 14. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Mordecai is reminding Esther, he's letting her know, he's saying that with or without you, God is going to save his people. That with or without you, God is going to continue to work out this plan. But God has chosen you to be a part, Esther. God is inviting you to be here. He says, don't think that you're going to escape. He says that justice and protection and provision is going to come from somewhere else. But God has chosen you to be a part. And he says, if you're not a part, he says, if you let this opportunity go, he says, protection will come, but you and your father's family, you'll pass away. Right? I want us to understand a couple things from this. One, I want to highlight something, and I understand that for some people, you're going to be like, oh yeah, we already knew that, and that's fine. But I feel like this is something that as a church, we need to make sure that we understand, that we support, and that we stand upon, is that God was choosing to use a woman. Right? Mordecai's word says that if it's not you, Esther, it will rise up from somewhere else. But God was choosing Esther. Why? Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. See, ever since God has created women, God has used and loved and uses in ministry and for his purposes women who will make themselves available just like he uses men. As a matter of fact, after Jesus rose from the dead, the very first person to declare the whole gospel, that Jesus has come, that he died for our sins, and that he rose again, was a woman who was there at the graveside. It wasn't one of the 12 disciples. In this moment in Esther, God is choosing to use a woman for his purposes and for his plans. He's choosing to use Esther. But if she would not be available, then God would find somebody else. In this moment, Esther finally made a decision that she was going to be available. She still didn't understand how to do anything. When Esther could only look and she saw the law and she saw the reality. She saw this is how things are. This is what it is. What am I supposed to do in the face of this? Sometimes we can look at a situation and everything we see is the truth. We're staring at an impossible situation. We're staring at a brick wall with no door and no way through. But when we look and see the impossible, God looks and he sees the potential for a miracle. He just needs somebody to make themselves available. He just needs somebody to be willing to take that step and to say, here I am. And I want you to know it's okay to struggle. It doesn't make us a bad Christian. It doesn't make us a bad person to struggle to be available. There are times that we have questions. There are times that we have doubt, and that's okay. Nobody's going to blame you for not jumping. Yippee! I get to go lay down my life. I get to sacrifice everything I planned for. How incredible is this? That's not realistic. And God doesn't expect that of you. It's okay to struggle. As a matter of fact, Jesus struggled. Jesus, who lived every moment, every decision, every word he said based on what the Father wanted, who lived his entire life on being available, struggled to be available at a certain point. See, we find Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Soon he's going to be arrested, and he goes in and he begins to talk to God. He begins to pray, and he says, God, if there's any other way, would you take this cup from me? Jesus was asking for another way for something to be done. God, if there's any way that I could not have to go through this. God, if there's any other way for your will to be accomplished. God, if there's any other way that we can save humanity without me having to go through this. But he always came back. Not my will, but your will be done. Jesus was choosing to be available, but Jesus was struggling because he knew what it meant. Jesus struggled with the weight of being available. But even with that weight, even knowing what was coming, how could Jesus make it to that point? How, when we know the sacrifice, how when we know the change, how when we know that it's going to hurt people for a while, how when we know that it's going to be hard, how when we know that it means that it's going to be a change, not just for us, but our entire life, our entire plans, for our entire family, how in those moments can we find the strength to be available? How could Jesus, knowing what the cross meant, knowing everything that was going to come, find the strength to be available? Well, that same night, just before the garden, Jesus was with his disciples, and he began to talk with them. And he began to talk to the disciples, and he said, your spirit is willing. You're willing to do all these things, but your flesh is weak. You're willing to follow me. You're willing to do this, but you don't have the discipline to do this. And he takes them, they go to the garden, and this is what he says. And he specifically takes 3 of them with him. And he says, I want you to pray. He said, I want you to pray. And he goes into the garden. And Jesus then enters into that time of prayer, where he begins to talk to God like we talked about. God, if there's any other way, would you take this cup, and not my will, but your will be done? Jesus began to pray in the garden that night. But all of the disciples began to fall asleep. And over the next few hours, as we begin to read what happened, Jesus found the strength to face the cross. But every single one of the disciples abandoned him. Every single one of the disciples who was so willing, who was so eager, who was so outspoken, who wanted to be available, they abandoned him in that moment. See, it was prayer that gave Jesus the strength, and it was prayer that caused the disciples to miss out on the strength they needed in that moment. And Esther found herself in a very similar moment. She was willing to be available. She was willing to do what God wanted, but she didn't know how. And she knew she couldn't do it on her own. And so she sent a message to Mordecai. She said, Mordecai, this is what we're going to do. She said, I'm going to do it, but first we're going to pray. And so she said, you out there, you Jews, fast for the next 3 days. And she said, me and those who serve me, she says, I'm going to make them, and I myself, we're going to fast for 3 days in here. And she said, then after that, she said, I'll go to the king. From there, everything was out of her power. To die or to live was no longer going to be her choice, but she was going to make herself available to the plans and the purpose of God. In the end, they fast, they pray. Esther goes before the king. The scepter is extended. Esther's life is spared. Haman is found out. And the Jews' lives are saved. All because she chose to make herself available. In the middle of a situation that was beyond her control, a young woman stood up to be available. As she faced what seemed to be impossible, a young woman stood up to make herself available. But it wasn't an easy journey for her. See, as the story unfolds, Esther was hesitant. She was in a position she didn't choose, but she had one thing that was in her control. Would she be available to the plans and the purposes of God? God had placed her in that position for that time and that purpose, just as God has placed you. In your work, in your family, in this community, and even in this church, for this very time and this very season, God has placed you where you are. God has a purpose for you where you are. And you may not have all the answers. You may have a lot more questions than any answers you ever have. There may be things that are out of your control, but one decision that is yours today is, will you be available? Knowing that God has a purpose, knowing that God has a plan, knowing that your life is not an accident, knowing that God has been with you from the very beginning, He's inviting you today to be a part of that plan. And Mordecai, he reminded Esther that God had placed her. And he challenged her. He said, although God wants to use you, if you won't step up, there are some times where things have to happen. And if you won't be available, then a time will come when God will find somebody who will be. See, there are seasons in our life where God will give grace and God will begin to allow us to begin to walk through that. But there reaches a certain point where if we won't choose to be available, God says, okay. He says, if you're not going to be available, he says, I've got a plan to accomplish. I'm going to find somebody who will be. See, God doesn't abandon his people just because one person won't choose to be available. He'll continue that search. But today, God has chosen you. God is inviting you. He's saying, can I find somebody else? Yes. But he says, I have chosen you first. And Mordecai's words remind Esther, he says, if you don't do this, he says, God's plan will still be fulfilled, but you and your father's household will disappear. And that's so often what happens. See, the very things that God invites us into are the things that are going to feed us and bring us life and encourage us and build us up and bring fulfillment, even in impossible situations. And so often what happens is when somebody misses out on the plans of God, they've missed out on the very thing that will fulfill them. And all of a sudden we see that they begin to have struggles for a while, and they begin to go through this journey, right? Look at Jonah. Jonah knew the plan of God, and yet he faced all this extra trouble because he chose not to be a part of that plan. Now, God gives grace, and God invites us, and He gives us a fresh start. And maybe there's times in your life you say, well, I'm looking back, and I missed the plan of God. I'm looking back, and I missed out on this. And God's not going to leave us to wallow in what we missed. He's going to bring a new opportunity. But we never want that to be an excuse to miss out on where God is inviting us right now. Today, God is inviting you to be a part of His plans. He's wanting to use you. Kathryn Kuhlman was a well-known evangelist. She ministered here across America from the late 1920s to the mid-1970s. An incredible woman of God, went around and as she ministered, her ministry was just full of signs and wonders. She was interviewed once, and this is what she said. I'll tell you something very confidentially. The true conviction of my heart, I do not believe I was God's first choice in this ministry and the ministry He has chosen for these last days. It's my firm conviction. You'll never argue me out of this conviction. Never. I'm not quite sure whether I was God's second choice or even His third choice, because I really believe the job I'm doing is a man's job. I believe God's first choice for this ministry was a man, His second choice too, but no man was willing to pay the price. I was just naive enough to say, take nothing and use it. And He's been doing that ever since. See, I'm much less concerned about the fact that she believed it was men that were called for that position before her. And much more concerned about the fact that there were those who were called before who missed out on a powerful move of God in their life because they weren't willing to pay the price. I'm not here to tell you today that being available is easy. I'm not here to tell you today that being available will cost you nothing. But I'm here to tell you that being available will give you everything. I'm here to tell you that becoming available will bring you more fulfillment, more joy, a deeper understanding and connection to God than anything in this world that you'd have to sacrifice. But I understand it's not easy. The Bible tells us, it says, if you're going to follow me, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. And that's what it means to be available. It means to take up that cross again and to say, God, I'm yours. I love how the author, Daniel Kalinda, he wrote an article about Kathryn, and it was for Christ for All Nations, and he summarized her feelings this way. He says, Kathryn Kuhlman believed she received her mighty anointing and calling not because she was the best, but because she was obedient. I'd only add one thing to that. Because she was obedient and available. When you read the Bible, you can pick almost any person in it, and you'll see that what set them apart was the fact that they made themselves available to God. Today, God still has dreams. Today, God still has desires. Today, we live in a day and age like never before. The Bible calls it the age of the Spirit. And God is wanting to do things like never before. But He's looking for individuals who will make themselves available.